Lisa Thie, the Data for Good sector lead at Launch Consulting. This season, we're sticking a little closer to home, but thinking just as big, harnessing the power of data to create a better global community. This is Navigating Abroad. In this episode, I talk with my friend Sergeant John Sydow about his career at the Sacramento Sheriff's Office, which is the 7th largest in the country. John has spent his career fighting for women and children on the front lines of law enforcement and has worked for the FBI in a global fight against human trafficking.
Glad to be here, one of my favorite people.
Oh, the feeling is mutual. So, John, we had a chance to connect a few years back when you were leading the human trafficking investigations. And one of the things I was really drawn to was your appetite for looking for new and innovative ways to rise for these vulnerable people that you are serving and protecting as best you can in an environment where these cases are very difficult cases. Can you set the stage for what it's like on the front lines when you're trying to help a traumatized 13-year-old stand up to a predator that they're involved?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of what we do is, in a way, not technology-based, but at the same time, technology can help us out quite a bit. It's really there to make our jobs easier and make us more effective. So when we're talking about a lot of human trafficking victims, for example, they're coming from some very horrendously troubled backgrounds. And there's a certain amount of understanding that needs to go into that when it comes to law enforcement, social services, and so on. There needs to be a lot of awareness on our side about what works and what doesn't work. There needs to be a lot of empathy that goes on when it comes to interacting with victims. And there needs to be a lot more robust, honestly, seeking victims and identifying them. That is definitely an area where we fall short, but that is also an area where I believe technology can help us. It has helped us, but we've got some drawbacks as a government agency. There's certain things that are easy for us to do and other things that are a little bit harder.
And rightly so. We want to have some controls and checks and balances on the surveillance that the government can do on its citizens. And if you don't mind sharing a little bit about some of the things you do in terms of training with victim advocates for law enforcement at a broader scale on trauma-informed training for interacting with trafficking victims, to the things that you do in hostage negotiation situations for police officers when things go wrong. Can you share a little bit about some of the activities you partake in? Because as an accountant from UCLA, I would not have expected this to be your career path. So can you tell us a little bit of the wide variety of what you cover?
As far as some of the training I do related to human trafficking, we have a thing in California. It's called the Peace Officer Standards and Training. It's our governing body, licensing, if you will. And then within that, there's Detective School, which is the Institute for Criminal Investigation. And so with that, I've helped develop 2 different courses, a foundational human trafficking course and an advanced human trafficking course, which cover a variety of topics. I don't teach. I teach a few of the blocks. I don't teach all of them, just help with the development side of it. So I still teach victimology, victim care and coordination, and then interviewing challenging victims are some of the areas that I do personally still train in.
And that was what was so interesting to me back in 2016 when we got the chance to meet and collaborate on a project for accelerating those cases using data and AI, was really that concept of how do we take the skills that you have from a math perspective and being able to ingest large amounts of data and make sense of a lot of detailed information with this really empathetic, trauma-informed approach. I mean, most men I know are not super interested in having lengthy conversations with traumatized 12-year-olds or having the patience to work on behalf of children. I think it's such a unique combination that you bring to the table, and it really inspires me to look at men stepping up for women's rights and truly the front lines of some of the most challenging situations. Can you get some examples of ways that you have been able to improve outcomes for victims in California in this space?
Yeah, definitely. And you're absolutely right that if I am something unique or different or special, that's sort of sad in a way. They're really, when it comes to law enforcement, which is a male-dominated field, we really should be having more men that are involved in this. We really should. It should not be an area where most of the detectives or most of the prosecutors are women. It's great that they are, but it's also show some of the weaknesses on the male side there. So as far as improving outcomes, some of the main things that are super important for us to do is essentially have a realization of what does success look like. And historically, of course, in law enforcement, it's, how many bad guys did you arrest? How many years in prison are they getting? And by those metrics, it's a difficult thing to judge. It really, really is. And it's hard to say what is true success in those areas anyway. So one of the things to look at when it comes to talking about reimagining what success is focusing on the victim more so than just going after the suspect. It's not a matter of we get called out for a victim, we interview the victim, maybe we arrest the bad guy, and as far as dealing with the victim, somebody else takes care of that. That has been sort of the old-fashioned way of doing it. And one of the things that I learned over time, I wasn't always really good at it, was that in order to have a degree of success in this area, it was very, very important that our victims were connected with the people they needed to be connected with, and connected with them early on. Not the idea of here's a pamphlet, call this number if you need help, but I call the person. They come out in the field, they meet with this victim. They make sure they essentially hold that victim's hand while they go through step 1, step 2, step 27 of moving towards a space of recovery. It needs to be much, much earlier intervention and assistance, and it's going to last longer than folks think it will, and it's going to be a lot more intensive than folks think it will. But in the end, it's going to have a payoff. And that's one of those metrics that is difficult to truly measure is, this child over here has been in and out of the justice system. This child over here is actually pointed in the right direction because of some early intervention. Trying to keep stats on that, trying to keep stats on quality of life, quality of the...
More qualitative than
Yes.
quantitative information.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
but those are the moments that matter, right? It's the person that maybe grew up with contact with our child protective services systems and maybe wasn't as protected as they should have been as a young person that, gets into a situation with someone that is pretending to solve all of their problems, right? You see so much correlation with drug activity, gun activity, and human trafficking because it's typically not an isolated crime. It's a means to an end for facilitating a network of crime. Can you help people unpack that a little bit about why we see some overlaps between those specific areas?
Absolutely. Prior to my work with human trafficking, I was on an FBI gang task force for a couple of years, and we did wiretaps and surveillance and all that other kind of cool TV stuff. But definitely what I saw was a lot of the factors that would lead younger men or boys into the world of gangs. Those are going to be the same factors and then some on the female side involved with girls getting involved in sex trafficking, being prostituted, things like that. So those are things that I think a lot of folks, and even I, when I worked patrol for years, I thought I understood kind of the dynamics of it. And it turned out it took me a couple years of working trafficking and interviewing a lot of victims to really, truly turn and start to have a better understanding of how people get to be where they are. And you're right, it's a multitude of factors. One of the things we talk about when we're covering victimology and teaching detectives about it is we talk about all these different vulnerability factors. And I try to point out, if you have a vulnerability factor such as a single parent household, or you have mother is addicted to drugs. Those are two of a lot. There's a lot of them in there. But if you have one of those singly, it's something that could potentially be sort of managed. There's assistance out there that can address that one in particular issue and kind of move things in the right direction. Now you get a dozen of them together, and it's really, really, really hard for especially a 13-year-old to navigate their way out of it, especially on top of everything else when they're living in an area that's surrounded by other people in their exact same situation. It kind of is feeding on itself, and there's no model out there to show this is not the life you have to live. There are other options available to you. We might sit back And that's one of the things I've had to do, like when I've testified in some jury trials as an expert, is explain to the jury, you can't look at this whole scenario through your eyes. You have to look at it through the eyes of a 13-year-old girl who grew up in a housing project. And what kind of opportunities did she have? What kind of opportunities did she even know existed? What had been taught to her growing up? And in some cases, parents are doing and struggling and working really hard and giving the best that they absolutely can. And unfortunately, because of the environment, some of the kids get kind of sucked into a negative life. There are some other parents that are not as careful, and unfortunately we deal with those as well. It's kind of a mixture. But those are some of the areas that, with multiple factors thrown in there, which I guess in a way is something that I think data, not necessarily big data, but data just in general, we pull in a lot of numbers related to a lot of these factors as far as from child welfare, how many kids have a mother who's got drug problems, a father maybe who's been to prison, early involvement with child welfare, other kids within the same family that have been taken away temporarily. There's a lot of different things that we do keep numbers on. And the issue is really kind of pulling that all together and seeing where things are overlapping.
And finding those pearls of wisdom to how to do effective intervention on behalf of these child victims, really. So John, I think a lot of people, when they think about human trafficking, they think of the movie Taken, for example. But we know from looking at the data that 72% of trafficking victims in California are actually American citizens and products of our society. So can you talk a little bit about how you've been able to help come meet them where they're at to help them grow past these survival crimes and give them better resources?
Yeah, it can be very, very challenging, and there's frankly just not enough of us with enough of a focus on this specifically to really handle the volume of people that are out there. So it is one of these areas where if we don't look for the victims, it's very easy for them to hide. They're not going to be coming and waving down the first police car they see saying, "Help me, rescue me." We have to really make a strong concerted effort on our side to go out, identify victims, contact them, and move forward even if they aren't terribly cooperative in the first place. The goal is to work with the victim. But if you work with the victim, as one of my old friends, Kim Hernandez, would say, you focus on the victim and the cases will come.
Yeah, because it's all dependent on that human experience, building trust, building respect, coming to people and having true compassionate empathy. And I think you really shine in that space of really caring how these people feel and not looking them as other or separate or not worthy of having the protection of law enforcement the way that other citizens may benefit from.
Yeah, it's one of those areas where, and I've explained this to detectives and social workers too over and over again, you are dealing with a population that has been manipulated and victimized and treated terribly and lied to throughout their life. And if you go in there and try to put on a false face, they're going to spot it and they're going to call BS, and it's just not going to ultimately work for you. So when it comes to this sort of area, certain things in law enforcement, they can train us to investigate a burglary, and they can train us to investigate an assault and things like that. Not everybody's going to be cut out to work with victim-centered crimes, sex assaults, child abuse, human trafficking. There are certainly things we can teach people to be better, and they could be decent at it. But some folks just aren't going to really mesh in that area.
If I'm not mistaken, your daughter is now considering following in your footsteps. Is this accurate?
She is. My older daughter, I have two. She is very strongly considering following in Dad's footsteps.
I think you're an excellent role model for many, so that doesn't surprise me in the least. You have worked beyond human trafficking in a lot of different areas, one of which you've been at some moments that matter in California history. I distinctly remember when the Golden State Killer was identified and apprehended, because it was so amazing to realize that somebody had the foresight 20 years ago to collect DNA evidence in order to be able to make the case when the technology advanced and caught up to be able to identify that particular person in that crime. you actually were at the jail when he was apprehended. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Yes, so I was not a part of the case and I was not a part of the investigation, and it was not up to me when he was identified and arrested, as cool as all that stuff would be. No, I was just a brand spanking new sergeant that had just promoted, and my first night at the jail was when they brought him in.
What a day.
Yeah. It was surprising because it's sort of this topic that's been talked about in my agency for the entire time I've been a cop. Talking about, for us, we called him the East Area Rapist, EAR. And of course, he became Golden State Killer, and he had a couple other names too, I think.
Night Stalker, I think.
The original Night Stalker, that's
Yes.
right. They finally put all those cases together and realized it was the same person.
Because you started in Southern California, and that was where some of his crime spree happened, and then you were also up in Sacramento. So you've been seeing his fingerprints over these years.
Yeah, yes and no. Yeah, I do. I can remember even before I was a cop, I can remember reading stories about it because it was a very big deal in, I think, late 80s, early 90s, when they were able to, through DNA, link together a variety of unsolved cases around the state. So they knew it was the same person, they just didn't know who it was yet. And so people like Paige Neeland with our department did a lot of genetic genealogy work over the years, and that really kind of put us someplace I never thought it was actually going to be solved. And I was really happy to see that it was, and that he was still around, and they could actually get some degree of justice with it.
It's really fascinating to me to see just the ways that we're able to leverage these data sets and information. And you would think, when you go into 23andMe, it's not going to say you're 3 connected. These genetic detective work, so to speak, takes months and months and months of a lot of follow-up. Do you mind sharing some examples of ways that you guys have been able to use new and emerging capabilities in order to be more effective in identifying people that are prolific offenders?
Yes, so a lot of that does go on the high-tech side when it comes to some of our online offenders. There's a lot of work that's done between the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, that's with my agency, the FBI, Homeland Security, and so on. They do a lot of that as far as trying to track down who individuals are and go out and locate them online and so on. There's also a section within FBI that deals with some of the travelers. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but folks that travel overseas to commit a variety of sex crimes. Sex tourism, thank you. Yes, and that takes a lot of studying and effort to really get into it, because the crime would be an American citizen traveling to another country with the intent to do something like that. And how do you prove it? Well, a lot of tech in there, awful lot of tech in there.
They leave the breadcrumbs in the digital trail, and you have to build that story and help people see all the evidence of the choices being made along the way to get to the ultimate.
Yeah, and like when I was the supervisor before, I was a supervisor for child abuse. I was the supervisor for our general assault unit, domestic violence, and one of our somewhat heinous cases where a person was doused in lighter fluid and lit on fire. I wasn't sure if we'd ever be able to have a fileable case out of that, but luckily one of our analysts spent a lot of time and effort pulling in data from phone records, cell phone examinations, social media, mapping, and so on, and was able to show, as they called it, a pattern of life. And it showed with our 2 suspects who was where at what time and how the pieces all essentially fit together. And so that was a case where not only was there an arrest, but there's a case filing, and it's moving its way through the process. And that is the type of technology and analytics that we are trying to use also on our side with child abuse, showing examples that essentially when it comes to physical abuse and child deaths, a lot of times it's, you're trying to figure out a timeline and narrow things down. Who was where at what time, and who did what, who said what, and so on. And you start out with this huge piece of time, and then through analytics from here, from there, from public sources, from private sources, you're able to kind of whittle it on down to the point where it's a really small window, and really only 1, 2, 3 people would have even been there when the incident could have occurred. And so that kind of stuff, and being able to present that in a way that is digestible to the DA and the jury, is a huge improvement that we've seen in the last few years.
It gets away from being reliant on victims' testimony and questionable memories to tangible evidence of where people were when, and able to really identify the moments that need to be intervened on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly one of the areas that is a problem in a lot of our victim-centered crimes, domestic violence, sex assault, child abuse, trafficking, there's this thought amongst some in the public and some in law enforcement that perhaps there are ulterior motives in there. Oh, somebody's making up this story.
I hear that a lot.
Yeah, to make this bad, to make this person sound bad. And that was definitely something I dealt with a lot in the early days of trafficking. And I started to learn after talking to enough attorneys and enough people that is one of the reasons that we focus so much on physical and especially electronic evidence, is to put less effort, you have less weight on the shoulders of your victim. The whole entire case doesn't rely on how reliable she is or how credible she is.
And it's re-victimizing her to have to continue, or him to continue to talk about those traumatic incidences and their experience. I think that's the power of data and unlocking tangible physical information with being able to look at that bigger picture, is relying less on re-victimizing somebody who never asked to be in that experience in the first place, and being able to more rely on a very clear pattern of provable actions that have resulted in this outcome.
Yes, for most of my career, I really tried to focus on victim-centered crimes, crimes where there are a lot of trauma towards the victim. And I guess it's not like I really sought it out that way, but that's just sort of how things have worked out. And I've definitely learned the importance of credibility and being able to lighten the load on victims and not have everything rest on them all the time, because that can just be a burden that is enormous, and it's not something they're going to be able to sustain.
And frankly, as a woman, it's terrifying to speak truth to power, somebody that has had control over you and the ability to commit a crime against you. Having to face that person and be braver than you have been historically able to be is quite a burden to put on someone, especially a young person. The types of cases that you handle, you tend to see some younger demographics in that. So I'm excited to see all the innovation and the focus you put in on being bold about your approaches to investigations and cases, democratizing empathy for trauma-informed policing. I think a lot of people really are concerned, and rightfully so, about the use of technology in policing and making sure we don't turn into a surveillance state. Can you talk a little bit about how and when you guys decide to use those types of things so that people have some understanding of the boundaries that are used when people are being, when we are seeing cell phone records, when you are seeing social media accounts?
So as far as information that's available to us and how we get it, no, we really do not have regular, ready access to a lot of the data that you might think about. Federal government, administrative subpoenas, but when we're talking about state law enforcement, local law enforcement across the country, we really aren't getting things without search warrants. So every time we want a piece of information, we need to write a search warrant, tell the judge essentially, this is what we're looking for. This is why we think we are able to get this type of information and how it's going to help our case. We have to be able to demonstrate that, and a judge has to review it and decide whether or not they agree with it. Now, the more invasive the types of things we're looking for, the greater scrutiny the judge is going to have, and the more that they're going to limit the scope in which we can really do it. So we don't get to just say, I want all of your phone records for the last 10 years, and we send it to AT&T. No, they're going to be looking at, what are you looking at, a small time period? Why would you need to have even a week before, 2 weeks before this particular event? What is the significance of that? So that kind of thing can be extremely important. You get into the world of like wiretaps, for example, they are extremely stringent on that, especially in California. You don't get to just do it whenever you want to. The rules are very, very strong, and it's very, very difficult to get one, and you're monitored constantly by the court while you're doing it. So it's not as though, you get just carte blanche to decide you want to look at this, you want to look at that. It's not quite as wide open as all that. But I think you and I have talked before about there can be a bit of a balance to it. We are concerned about privacy rights, believe it or not, because we look at it like, we don't want, how would you want somebody looking in your house? Would you want somebody looking in your phone? And generally, no. But when you've committed certain types of crimes, then that's going to open up the door to certain types of evidence. It just is, unfortunately, for the people involved. But the goal is not just to go out there and collect a bunch of data so we can sit on it and gather intel on potential bad people. It's, specifically related to some type of criminal activity that we're looking for.
And it's a victim-centered crime that you're investigating, and you typically have that victim reporting it to you before
Yes.
you're uncovering those stones.
We're largely reactive, law enforcement in general, and definitely in the stuff that I've worked with victim-centered. It would help us to be a bit more proactive, not, looking to, basically what I mean by proactive is we know that these victims exist. We know with sex assault, there's a tremendous amount of underreporting going on. Child abuse, lots of underreporting. We only see a tiny fraction of it. If we were to find methods that were successful to go out and contact people, put ourselves into situations, into scenarios where we were able to identify additional victims that weren't willing to come forward initially, that would be a huge improvement in this world.
So why is it that if I leave my car parked at a parking meter a little bit too long, there's always somebody to put a ticket on it? But for, crimes that as a woman are honestly some of my worst fears, like not only to be victimized, but maybe victimized by someone you love, someone you trust. Why is it so challenging for law enforcement to intervene in these instances?
So unfortunately, that is an area that crosses over into the world of politics. So it doesn't matter if it's the city council, the city police department, the sheriff's department, the highway patrol. Every one of those people is answerable to the voting public, and they're the ones that hear all the complaints that come in. And I've told people constantly when I've presented to community groups and law enforcement groups, service providers, I've said, if you are unhappy with the prioritization with your local police, you need to make sure that city council, the mayor, all those folks know about that this is important to you and this is why. Because realistically, that's where the change happens.
And I can't think of anything more important than protecting our legacy, which you do every day. So I want to thank you for your service. And I also want to say thank you for being more open and kind of unpacking for the people like me that maybe only learn about these things in podcasts or maybe watching things on TV. But to see the amount of hours and commitment and resilience that goes into standing up for those that can't stand for themselves, I really want to applaud your boldness in applying that accounting degree to protecting our next generation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me.